The first speaker is Dr. Yolanda from Amnesty International, who is the researcher for Sri Lanka. And she's going to talk obviously about the IDP camps and a little bit about accountability and also what Amnesty has been doing and the campaigns Amnesty have around the camps. So I'll hand over now to Yolanda, and you can tell us a little bit, introduce the topic and tell us a little bit about what you're going to talk about.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks very much to the Tamil Legal Advocacy Forum for inviting me to this important event. 2009 has been a particularly dramatic, very violent and historic year for many Sri Lankans. In May, the government declared victory over the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Nadu, ending nearly 26 years characterised by widespread human rights abuses and abuses of international humanitarian law. Massive displacement was a feature of this recent conflict. And one of the things that has scarred the current victory is the fact that the last months of the conflict were particularly brutal, with spiralling civilian casualties. Many ordinary civilians who were trapped in the valley between the warring parties lived in terror in the final months of the war. By the end of May, an additional 300,000 displaced people had fled the fighting and are now detained in over 40 camps spread across Barbunia district, Mannar, Jaffna and Trincomalee. At least 50,000 of these people living in the camps are actually young children, and many are severely disabled. Hundreds of thousands of people, as a consequence of this detention, are now denied very basic rights of liberty and freedom of movement. Perhaps the most well-known camp to all of you is Menik Farm in Barbunia district, which houses approximately 250,000 people. Walter Kalin, who is the Special Representative to the Secretary General of the United Nations, visited Sri Lanka last week and made a trip to Menik Farm. He noted that camps for the displaced remain overcrowded and unsanitary. Management of these camps is supervised by the military. Camps are guarded by armed personnel, and camp managers are often retired military officers. It's the Ministry of Defence who has been actively involved in determining who gets access to the displaced. The key issue is that displaced people are not permitted to leave. They are in fact detained without a charge or trial, and this is a violation of Sri Lanka's obligations under international law, which prohibits arbitrary detention. It is also in violation of Sri Lanka's constitution. Article 14 guarantees and upholds the freedom of movement. I think we all need to remember that the Sri Lankan government itself misrepresented the scale of the humanitarian crisis as fighting intensified. In the final months of the conflict, the government released public figures for the population trapped between the warring parties that was far below the actual number trapped. As a result of this, the government is not adequately prepared to deal with food, water and shelter needs of this enormous newly displaced population. It has also refused to allow international aid agencies unrestricted access to help with this crisis. People that I have spoken to, relatives of the displaced, describe how people queue for hours just to get bottles of water and how ad hoc the nature of food distribution is in the camps. The government has now loosened some of the access restrictions to allow for the delivery of material relief to the camps, but international agencies continue to be prevented from talking to the displaced people and engaging in crucial human rights protection work, such as interviewing people, conducting needs assessment, and documenting violations they have suffered, and indeed just practical things such as reuniting families who've become separated inside the camps. One of Amnesty's key concerns is the complete lack of independent monitoring inside these camps. Human rights concerns persist even after the so-called end of the conflict. We have received reports of arbitrary arrests and detention inside the camps, enforced disappearances, abductions, and other forms of ill treatment. Despite the enormous protection concerns inside the camps, the government of Sri Lanka announced on the 9th of July that it was directing some aid agencies, including the International Committee of the Red Cross, to scale down their operations in Sri Lanka. In short, Sri Lanka's camps for the displaced have become places of mass arbitrary detention, and this must cease immediately. Displaced people living in the camps should be free to move in and out and exercise their right to freedom of movement. The government claims that it is holding people in the camps in order to conduct screening of the displaced, to identify ex-combatants and fighters, but this is not a justifiable reason to detain civilians, including whole families, the very old and young children, for indefinite periods in which their human rights are not being protected. There are separate detention facilities for approximately 10,000 of these ex-combatants, which are separate from the 40 camps that I mentioned, housing up to 250,000 people. One of the key protection issues inside the camps is the fact that paramilitaries or Tamil armed groups, which are proxies to the government, groups like the EPDP and Plot, and some of the Corona faction group, are actually allowed to operate inside these camps with impunity. We have documented reports of a release and bribe scheme inside the camp, which is being carried out with the collusion of the security forces, and in fact I have interviewed a number of relatives of the displaced who have been fundraising in order to secure the release of their relatives through this paramilitary bribe system. I think what's important when looking at the human rights issues of the camps is to locate the setting up of these camps and in fact trends that we might see in the future of resettlement in the context of systemic impunity in Sri Lanka. The recent conflict has served to highlight the entrenched nature of impunity within Sri Lanka. As Sri Lankan people now contend with the most recent abuses committed by both sides of the recent conflict, the reality is that they have been haunted by injustice and impunity for many years. Amnesty received credible and consistent reports that both the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Nadu and the Sri Lankan government committed violations of international humanitarian law in the course of the conflict, and in particular in the final months. The LTT forcibly recruited children as soldiers, it did use civilians as human shields, and we have reports of civilians who were attacked as they tried to flee the no-fire zone. On the Sri Lankan government's part, the Sri Lankan armed forces launched indiscriminate attacks with artillery on areas densely populated by civilians. Hospitals were shelled, resulting in death and injuries amongst the patients and staff. And I should add that as a result of the deliberate misrepresentation of how many civilians were trapped in the no-fire zone, this also had a consequence on the amount of food aid entering the Vani and medical supplies, so that also had an impact on the ordinary civilian population.